Thank you so much for your introduction and welcome everyone. I'm here, the Professor of Classics at the university, and I always like to engage in discussion, conversation, and what is today called a great debate. Well, I'm sure you want to say, we'll see about that. But anyway, and I represent the classical perspective. Classics studies every aspect of the ancient world in Greece and Rome, including the historical context of the time that Jesus was alive. So it might be of interest to you to think about even having a look at our courses at some point. But today I'll be talking about a couple of perspectives in the ancient world which come out of a group of people that we call philosophers, because in those days a philosopher was someone who was seeking wisdom. That's what the word philosophia literally means. So they weren't really making big claims about what they knew, they were making claims about what they wanted to know. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. Now I'll hope to present to you just quickly three interesting perspectives here, because as Corinne said, it's about giving some thought-provoking ideas here. And these three perspectives are representing three particular schools of thought. One, most famous one, Socrates. Then I'll jump on to Aristotle, and lastly, a man called Epictetus, a Stoic. So I hope that that will give you some idea of what kind of views were represented in the ancient world. Now, these positions are not recipes for a successful life, but in the spirit of Greek philosophy, they are particular perspectives on the question, what makes for a meaningful life? Most philosophers will say that the challenge of how to live our life requires a permanent reflection on our life, an attentive attitude, a kind of regular check of one's actions and your moral compass. In other words, it is an ongoing process, something which cannot be solved simply by a prescriptive set of guidelines. We would all like to have the manual to life, I'm sure. But the enormous variety and huge number of possible outcomes of each day seem to militate against such a simple idea. Many philosophers might even say that the greatest certainty we have is that there is no certainty. And this is not necessarily a bad thing. It just means that you have to work at it. It complicates how we make our choices and what we aim for in life. Now, it's not a coincidence I chose some philosophers, because these people thought really hard about this question. This is not a new question. That's important to remember. And I have two reasons to bring to you 3 points of view from the Hellenic perspective, 2 before Christianity came along and 1 during Christianity's time. I have 2 reasons for this. Firstly, I want to make the point that wisdom is not the prerogative of one particular philosophical or religious outlook, nor of one particular culture. You might find it anywhere. And I don't have time today to look into, say, Eastern wisdom, but that would be another way to look at things like this. Secondly, the people I've chosen illustrate that across time the question of meaningful life has been of great importance, and one that is not so easy to answer. So again, these are not recipes, these are triggers for further thought, and each individual will have to make some choices about how they do things themselves. Now, to start with Socrates. Famously, Socrates said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." And of course, he didn't mean that you need to have exams in your life. He meant that you have to have a kind of attitude where you critically analyze what you need to do in life, which decisions you make. Socrates is famous for meeting up with people and questioning their purposes, their motives, their activities. In one famous case, a son was going to drag his father in front of a court because he thought his father had committed a crime. But at the same time, Socrates said, well, but he's your father. And these are difficult questions to deal with. So it's those kinds of practical questions he was engaging with in order to find a way out. And these are moral issues. Now, because everyone's life is determined by the time in which they live, I want to say a few things about Socrates' life. He lived through the best and the worst of times in Athens in the 5th century BC. First, when the city rose to power because they had defeated Persian armies. Next, when they had a war with Sparta, which led to defeat and a cruel regime of 30 tyrants. So what should a philosopher offer their fellow citizens when he's been crushed by war and a city has been ravaged by plague and then terrorized by tyrants? Those are not simple circumstances. And Socrates saw that the city needed moral guidance, as today a war-ravaged country will lose its values, will try to just survive and not worry so much about ethical questions. And so these situations will lead to a moral vacuum. And Socrates realized that. And he said, we need guidance in what is right and wrong, just and unjust, and fair and unfair. He thought the citizens of Athens should consider their life's choices and actions in order to create a better society. So when he speaks of an unexamined life, he does not mean we should just have any kind of perspective, but cast a critical eye on how we live and how we come to a particular purpose in what we want to achieve. In Plato's dialogues, we see Socrates in action, debating all kinds of interesting questions, and him insisting that it requires clear thinking and debate. So perhaps as we do today, clear thinking and debate might be something that is an important element in finding your particular purpose and your element, but also you can hear that there's a social dimension to his thinking. It's about serving community. My next example is Aristotle. Now, he was a student of Plato, so that might mean that he is sort of the intellectual grandchild of Socrates, given that Plato was a student of Socrates. Aristotle was a very impressive philosopher, but he's also very serious, so I'll keep it very short. He will sort of put a damper on the atmosphere if I go on too long. He's interesting. I mean, he talked about all kinds of things: physics, cosmology, metaphysics, biology, you name it. Very clever man. But fortunately, he didn't forget to think about ethics as well, about how to give your life meaning. And he wrote this up in a couple of works, the most famous one named Nicomachean Ethics. His answer to the question of the meaning and the purpose of life is a slightly different one from Socrates. He famously spoke of the purpose of life as to make sure that you thrive, that you reach well-being. Now, what does that mean? Sometimes, actually, it is also translated as happiness. And again, you could ask, what does that mean? Well, it turns out that the translation might mislead a little bit, because the word he uses is eudaimonia. And the Greek word literally means having a good spirit look after you. And in some translations, depending on what your life perspective is, people might say that means just blessed, right? You just means that you have got a kind of guardian angel. Well, we might compare it to that, but Aristotle is far more rational about it. So what he thinks is important is, 1, your character, 2, a kind of intellectual hygiene, again, clear thinking, and social awareness. And the aim of his work on ethics is the following. He says, it is to give one a reflective understanding of how one can achieve happiness by living an ethical life within society. That was my warning, so I'll jump quickly to my last person, Epictetus. Epictetus is a Stoic philosopher who lived in the second half of the 1st century under the Roman empress. Epictetus started life as a slave. His name literally means acquired, bought. So he was just a piece of furniture for the Romans. But later on he was released. So the remarkable thing is that he overcame his own circumstances, personal circumstances, and managed to teach moral philosophy in a way that is incredibly generous and simple. So I'm going to leave you with his simple motto that we can perhaps discuss a little later. And his motto was, of all the things that exist, some are up to us and others are not up to us. And what he meant by that is very clever. He meant what is up to us is what you have in your control. And what is not up to us is what you don't have in your control. And he says that determines basically everything you do. If you strive for something which is not in your control, say you want to change the weather, that's bad strategy because you're going to try and overreach. But your own choices is in your control. So if you make good choices, he says, then you might reach a kind of balance and happiness, because in that way you don't overreach and don't frustrate your own aims and objectives. So he would argue you mustn't get upset, but you must, on a daily basis, consider, what do I have today? What do I have to do today? Is this within my control? Can I reach these aims? Achievable outputs, they would say nowadays, especially when you're a researcher at this university. And you would have to make sure that while you can strive to become better, you don't overreach. So in short, the three views I've presented to you seem to have in common that they have an interest in the importance of character, but not just to actually accept it simply, but try to make it better by way of clear thinking, good actions, and a social awareness that makes your life meaningful, not just because you take satisfaction in what you do, but you are useful to other people. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to address you today. I think it's brilliant to see university students who are keen to ask some of the bigger questions in life, not just think about how to pass exams. It's a great honour for me to be able to share the platform with Han. As you've just heard, he's a profoundly thoughtful and insightful scholar and a wonderful member of the university community. He and I, in many ways, have much in common when it comes to anthropology, to how we understand who people are. We both recognise the dignity and worth of humanity and the incredible potential to make our world into a better place. Having said that, we do have different views on what we'd like the world to change to and how to go about it. And my brief today, as I understand it, is to show how, at least in my opinion, Jesus of Nazareth, whom Han referred to, offers the most fulfilling and satisfying and enriching way to live. The key for me for today's debate is that word meaningful. How do you define meaning? Or, sorry for the pun, what does meaningful mean? The Jesus who you meet in the Bible, amongst many things, I think has three suggestions as to what that word meaningful stands for. Here they are: impacting, lasting, and purposeful. Impacting, lasting, and purposeful. And for just a few minutes, I'll say something about each of those three. Firstly, impacting. By this, Jesus is saying that a meaningful life makes a difference. It has impact, and especially on others. It's interesting that Jesus never talked about changing the world. He never spoke of saving the planet. He made no great technological innovation. He never agitated for regime change, and he never built a global empire. Rather, his teaching was all about how individuals treat each other. They were to do so with dignity and respect. And perhaps most famously, you would have heard that expressed in what's the so-called golden rule: do to others as you would have them do to you. Or, as he said differently, love your neighbour as you love yourself. He even took that to its logical conclusion. At times he would say, love even your enemies. Impacting. That's one way in which Jesus defines meaning. A second was lasting. Lasting. Because not only does Jesus advocate a life of integrity and charity and thoughtful conviction, he was clearly concerned with what is still to come, in what follows after death, and so is ongoing and never ending. To put it slightly differently, though Jesus affirmed that this world is very good, and most of us here in 21st century Adelaide can attest to that, though he affirmed that this world is good, he also consistently maintained that it's not good enough, if for no other reason than it will not last. And that means that any impact we have with our lives will soon be forgotten and fade away. Thus for Jesus, a key dimension of meaningful is ongoing significance. Ultimately, he will say what is eternal. And that's why Jesus will give such challenging advice as, Don't worry about those who can take your life. Fear the one who can throw you into hell. Not many people realise that in the Bible, the person who speaks most about hell is the love others as yourself Jesus. But it's clear that when he does so not to scare us, but to warn, because he deeply cares. Now for some, you might be wondering on what authority Jesus can speak about life after death. The Bible says he's qualified in such weighty matters because of his own resurrection from the dead, which shows that death is of no lasting concern to him. Okay, impacting, lasting. Thirdly, purposeful. Purposeful. Now, I realise, of course, that talking about life after death to fit and healthy undergrads who have their whole life ahead of them, that's a pretty hard sell. Even those who do think about eternity might very well come back with, well, you know what, Jeff, I'll deal with that when I'm older, like 40 or something. Putting aside the obvious reflection that, well, none of us know how long we have left, I thought I'd finish with what I think might appeal to an options generation, instant gratification millennial. When it comes to defining the meaningful life, Jesus emphasised the importance of purpose, of living our lives in alignment with why we are here in the first place. Let me be clear, not why you are here, because that sounds a little bit like, so where did I come from? And that will probably invoke all kinds of repressed nightmares about high school sex ed classes, and we're not going to go there today. Rather, why are we here as a race, as a species on planet Earth? What is our purpose? According to Jesus, the answer to that most basic question is that we're not just the product of random chance. Rather, Jesus says we've been wonderfully made, designed, fashioned, sculpted by a creator who loves us deeply and longs for us to share in all that is his. The best illustration, I think, is of parents who choose to have children. Not to complete their relationship, what a terrible burden for their kids if that's why they're born, but to share their blessings with others. And to be crystal clear, the Christian God has not manufactured us to be robots or slaves. Jesus speaks of how he loves us with an unfailing love. And the best measure of that is that in the end, Jesus says we get to address this maker not just as Master or Lord, but primarily as Father, and even more intimately as Dad. I understand that for many of us, we have a far from perfect relationship with our parents. But even if that's the case, it's a reminder that that's not how things ought to be. So here I'll finish. If what Jesus says is true, the implication is that the key to a meaningful life is about being reconciled with the one who made you for a reason, made you for a purpose. Now, the first step towards any reconciliation, of course, is thankfulness. After all, the right response to anyone who gives you anything is gratitude. The result is what those who are followers of Jesus want for others. They want them to have what they have, to know why we're here, to be clear what our purpose is, to experience the joy and fulfilment and satisfaction of doing what you're meant to do with the days that are allotted to you. I don't think there's any better way to live, actually. And perhaps, if you're here today at the invitation of your Christian friend, you might ask them how they discovered for themselves what is this meaning of life. Thanks very much.
Is he scared?
I don't know much about classical Socrates, etc., so thank you for what you were outlining before. Did any of them ever talk about life after death, and did they have any ideas about if that exists or what they were thinking?
Yes, thank you for that question. It's a very good one because they were debating this issue as well. There's a long tradition in the ancient world, even beyond the Greeks, Egypt, Babylon, you name it. all these cultures had some idea about what might happen after death. And most of them have a story about there being a world that you go to, and it has something to do with where you end up and how you lived your life. So there's a kind of correlation between, did you have a good life? You might end up in a nice place. Did you actually were you a criminal or a bad person? You might end up in a very bad place. They started to develop these ideas, and in the Greek world, this starts to happen very much more. Now, Socrates said, I don't know what the fuss is about. He's a very rational person. So he says, well, either it is this wonderful thing that I will go to this underworld and meet up with great people like Achilles and Agamemnon and all these other famous heroic people from the Homeric age, and I can talk to them. Or he said, it's like a long sleep, like a dreamless sleep, and I really don't mind that either. So for him, it was a win-win situation. You went to that world, or you had a long sleep that unfortunately you wouldn't wake up from. Now, a little further along, you get even longer stories and more elaborate accounts of what this world down there is. And it starts with his student Plato. And the interesting thing about that is that people start to think harder and harder about how good is your life and what do you deserve in terms of that afterlife. So many of the Greeks and the Romans believe in an afterlife, and from Plato onwards, they started to think that if you don't live a good life here, you'll end up in a very bad place over there. That's basically my short answer there.
Thank you, Han. Any other questions? Yeah, stand up.
Thank you for a quick summary at the start. I was just wondering, you were mentioning how they said how you should make good choices, that's in control, and justice and stuff. Did they have an explanation of what would be considered good, or was it sort of just based on what was socially acceptable in that time?
Now that is basically the big crux of the whole discussion, isn't it?
Sorry.
No, don't apologize. That's a terrific question. I mean, this is basically why the debate doesn't stop, yes? And as I said somewhere along the line, everybody is determined by the time they live in. So when you ask this question, it's very important to realize which period of time you are looking at in order to be aware of what the standards were for those kinds of questions. But you're right, a big part of the answer is what people thought is acceptable. And there are standards of not just ethics, but also etiquette, right? And the Greeks, for instance, have got standards that have to do with your class. So Plato is an aristocrat, right? So somebody who's from a slightly better standing, and he thinks that his parents were better than a lot of other people as well. And so their standards had to do with matching up with the layer of the population that they live with and say, what do you think about how you should hold a debate? Well, I think that some of the standards that Corinne has laid down for us today would be considered of origin an aristocratic type of standard, where you say you respect each other, you don't start shouting or even hitting each other when you have a disagreement. Because first of all, people get hurt, and second of all, it doesn't solve the question, right? You don't get a real answer to that. And so there is something about what Jeff earlier said in the sense that respect for people, in the way that you leave them in their status, their well-being, you don't hurt them, is some of the very basic standards that are involved in what you do to make good choices. But there were also problems that were not so easily solved. As I said, the example I had about the man dragging his father in front of a court and saying, I'm going to accuse him of, he had maltreated a slave, I think. And what you get from that is a very difficult decision to say, well, he is my father, but does that mean I shouldn't admit that he has committed a crime? I think I would be tempted to send this little problem to the United States. But that's another matter. Thanks.
Again, any questions? Yeah.
So this one's for Han. I was just wondering if ethics sort of changed
Now, I think the question is about are there absolute standards of ethical behavior, but I could be wrong. I think in a sense there are not, but if you look across the various cultures and periods of time, they have a lot of overlap. And I think the best way to go about answering this question in detail would be to say, okay, there are some changes and perspectives that are different to what we saw before, but there's also reason to believe that in certain ways people don't change as much as we might think. This is one of the reasons why I love to study the classics, because they have been very influential on the Western tradition. And some of the things they set then still hold now. Of course, but Jeff would come in and say, yeah, it's not just the pagan tradition, you'd have the Judeo-Christian tradition as well that has mixed together. And that's absolutely true. I wouldn't disagree with that. So if you have a fear that this notion of change might endanger the idea that we would get ever a good standard of behavior, I think the risk is not as great as you might expect because of the overlap that is there. And that is because the interaction between humans is largely stable. There are a number of ways in which they differ. And of course there are sometimes extremes, but it's like a spectrum. And I think there is a bulky middle that you could trace through time. But it would require a little bit more detail, for which I don't have time, because I hear the bell coming. So it's one of those things that... Does that answer more or less your question? Thanks. Great.
Any other questions? Oh, we'll go down here first. Stand up.
My question is to Jeff. So if Jesus is real and Jesus makes our life meaningful, what does it mean since we're going to die anyway?
Yeah, the question was, if Jesus is real and he makes a difference, so what difference does it make if we're going to die anyway? Is that right? Yeah. Jesus is real, what difference does it make if we're going to die anyway? Well, I think to pick up actually on something that Hans said earlier, I think many cultures have a sense or a belief that what you do now and what you do with this life has some kind of lasting significance. They vary on the correlation between what you do now and what that lasting significance is. But I think it's fair to say, apart from as best I can tell, anthropologically, the relatively small number of cultures that don't think there is any kind of eternal state, all think that what you do now does in some way affect what you do later. I think the real question is, what is the correlation between the two? And most people, I think, observationally, are of the view that if you live a good life, that leads to good reward. The complication is that the way Jesus addresses it is that he won't make that causal link in the way in which we want him to. Like, we want him to say, yes, if you do good things, if you love your neighbour as yourself, there's a reward for that. The connection is never quite that strong because there's a reality about the way in which Jesus understands our finiteness and our inability to do even what we commit to doing. And so that inadequacy raises a different problem. It means, therefore, that actually the way Jesus will describe it is we all seek to live a particular way. None of us get there, and therefore you need some kind of external intervention. And the external intervention, of course, from Jesus that's a divine intervention. That's the way in which he's constructed the worldview that he's speaking of. So, thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? We'll go right up the back in this corner. Thanks.
My question is to Jeff. Why did I suppose, just to understand the Christian perspective, just to understand the Christian perspective, why would the God of Israel
Yeah, thanks very much. I presume people could hear the question. Why does, at least in the biblical story, the God of the Bible choose to reveal himself to one tribe, the Israelites, and why not any other tribe? Thank you for asking the question. I'd love to be able to say because and fill it in. So I guess I'm acknowledging at this point the inadequacy of any answer that I give. I say that because I don't think the Bible, which is for me and for most Christians the frame of reference or the authority, it's just not clear. That is, it doesn't answer that question explicitly. So to presume to do so is actually, well, it's presumptuous and I think inappropriate. What is clear is that in choosing to show himself to one nation, that came across wrong. Please don't quote me on that. To one tribe, the expectation was that through that one tribe, everyone would come to know and come to know who God is. Now, I understand that kind of just shifts the question because fairly we'll come back and say, well, why not just tell everyone at once? Why not put it on the internet? Whatever it is. So I understand that. I can't answer that. But what I can say is that the Bible is very clear that it wasn't ever meant to be just a God reveals himself to Israel, the rest of you miss out. The expectation was that in revealing himself to Israel, the whole world will come to know. And the kind of progression or the trajectory is through Israel to Jesus, who is, as you know, a Jew, and then through him to the whole world. So you hear me kind of dancing a bit in the answer because I don't want to overstate things, but I do want to point out what the Bible is clear about, and that's probably the best answer I think to give there. So thank you.
We had a question, down the front, and then we'll go to the back. Yeah.
This is Jeff. So Han was saying about how changing ethics kind of changed our meaning of life. With the Bible, without changing ethics, is it harder to relate to Jesus' version of the human form?
Yeah, thank you. Just if I can paraphrase the question, it's a question about if the Bible's the basis of ethics, and I presume what you're hinting at is the fact that the Bible's actually a very ancient text now, and we live in a very different context, does that mean therefore what it has to say about current ethics is not as relevant? That's a fair summary? Hard to relate to, yeah. Yes, it is. That's probably the best thing to say. There is a translation that needs to take place. Although I think actually that's how we live our lives. That is, don't just talk about the Bible. When you hear something, when you see someone else's experience, or when you listen to someone else's wisdom, you still have to make the translation exercise in your own head as to how it applies in your situation. So I think that's actually, and for Han to speak rightly, I think of the way in which in classical thought, wisdom is the key to that. That's certainly a concept that comes through loud and clear in the Bible and in Jesus' teaching. Perhaps the best thing I can say about the actual content of the question is that much of what Jesus speaks of, I think, is timeless in the sense that it transcends culture and even context. The clearest example of that, I think, is love your neighbour as yourself. You don't need to be living in 21st century Adelaide or in 1st century Palestine to understand the principle. The question of how you play that out will look very different because of your opportunity, but nevertheless, the aspect of your character and the desire for the way in which you live, I think that is still constant. I probably should add, Christians have done a particularly bad job, I think, of trying to show how what Jesus speaks of does cross culture and time. And sometimes they've been simplistic and naive in the way in which they've talked about that. And for that they ought to bear appropriate responsibility. But my observation is, particularly amongst a tertiary or a nearly tertiary educated crowd, if you read actually the Bible for yourself, you'll be able to make that connection in your head and then make decisions for yourself. And that's what we'd encourage you to do. Thank you.